I'm going to begin this discussion by reading you aloud what I would consider the single most ancient and influential anti-Semitic conspiracy theory in the history of Europe, in the history of the Western world. And I'm going to ask you to reflect on your own education in primary school, in high school, in as much as your formal education even mentioned Judaism and Jewishness in the history of Europe, the United States, or what have you. To what extent your own instructors were themselves also victims of or purveyors of this peculiar anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. I'm going to quote you something from the 13th century. Quote, "If a man dies owing money to Jews, his wife may have her dower and pay nothing toward the debt from it. If he leaves children that are under age, their needs may also be provided for on a scale appropriate to the size of his holding of lands. The debt is to be paid out of the residue, reserving the service due to his feudal lords. Debts owed to person other than Jews are to be dealt with similarly." The text I am quoting to you is the Magna Carta, what is normally referred to as the first and perhaps only Constitution of England or the British Isles. If you read the Magna Carta from beginning to end, you might expect the issue of multiculturalism, or shall we say, relations between different ethnicities, to at least mention the Scottish, the people of Cornwall, the Welsh, the difference between Yorkshiremen and Southerners, the myriad ethnically and linguistically distinctive groups that at that time the British Isles were separated into. If you don't know, in the year 1215, people in Wales, the people in Cornwall spoke very different languages. Within walking distance of London, England, you were dealing with mutually unintelligible dialects. This is well attested for history. There is no discussion of, there is no mention of any ethnicity other than the Jews. And yet the Jews, this infinitesimally tiny minority within England, are mentioned emphatically again and again. And throughout the Magna Carta, as you heard in that passage, there is this notion that Jews are the people who invented banking in Europe. There's this implicit assumption that when speaking of banking, of debts, of transactions of this kind, of loans, and of collecting interest, one would be speaking of the Jews. Now, I'm asking you to reflect in your own education, in primary school, in high school, in university, in as much as your parents told you anything about the history of Europe, the history of Judaism, or the history of anti-Semitism per se within the history of the Western world. This might be the only thing anyone ever told you. It might well be that you grew up being told that the reason for anti-Semitism was, in fact, that the Jewish people had this unique and powerful connection to the charging of interest, usury, and banking. Between the year 1200 and 1600, what was the greatest center of banking in Europe? Who were the great innovators in the economic history of Europe? Was it Jerusalem? Was it the overseas Jewish community of Athens? I mean, where were these great banks that the Jews, as they're called in the Magna Carta, were operating? In fact, from the year 1200 to the year 1600, the great center of banking in Europe was Italy. The single greatest center of banking was Genoa, and Genoa was in direct competition with Venice and Florence. there's more than one really strange source of bias here. One is simply this propensity to be fascinated with Jews and the roles of Jewish people in the history of Europe, which we're going to talk about further in this video. And the other, which seems more strange to me as I get deeper into my middle-aged years, is this strange tendency to delete and diminish the historical significance of Italy. It's as if we only want Italy to be important in the period of ancient Rome, and then for Italy's importance to suddenly end and disappear without a trace thereafter, right? I don't know. This sense that in Rome, everything good is dead and everything dead is good. And that, I don't know, shortly after the death of Julius Caesar, there's nothing more to be said about, say, anything in Italy, Rome specifically, or more broadly, including places like Genoa. The less said, the better. Well, guess what? If you make a list of the crucial innovations in the history of banking in Europe, when they were first done, and where it was that the millions of dollars were being moved, that the really big money happened, Genoa is going to be number one on your list. But it's not the Genoese. It's not the Christians of Italy, of Florence, of, Venice and so on. That's not who's named in the Magna Carta, in the Constitution. That's not who they're concerned about, right? There's this great sense of othering the Jewish minority, of naming them as this threat to the national identity, ethnic coherence, and so on of the nations of Western Europe. And it's already well underway in the year 1215. The irrationality of it, the extent to which it's fictionalizing economic and political reality within Europe, right? It's already well underway here. Now, let me just ask you also, who was more of a threat to the political destiny of England in the year 1215? In the year 1215, when the Magna Carta is written, England is not a terribly powerful nation. It's really not. I mean, if you're comparing it to any of the countries on the mainland of Europe, whose influence does England have to worry about and curry favor with and send, who's really a threat to whichever decisions the petty dukes and lords and kings of England might engage in for, say, the century after that? Italy. Yeah, Rome, the Vatican. And generally speaking, again, all of those great emporiums of international trade on the Mediterranean, those are the powerful cities in Europe in this period, right? And yet already we have this conspiracy theory mentality written into the Constitution of England, into the Magna Carta, into one of the most influential, the most commonly read texts in the British tradition. This video is going to talk about the origins of multiculturalism. It's going to present my own critique of multiculturalism. And it's going to talk about anti-Semitism. And this video is recorded at a time when we have just had another mass shooting in the United States of America, a mass shooting from a white male who wrote a manifesto, put it on the internet, declaring why it was he was carrying out this shooting, stating and explaining his racist beliefs. And you will note that without feeling he needed to explain this in any way, he treats it as a self-evident fact that multiculturalism itself is a Jewish conspiracy. There's no footnote there. His fear, this part has been well documented in the mainstream press. His fear is what's called the replacement theory or great replacement. His fear is the so-called genocide of the white race and so on and so forth. But it's not that he's afraid this is happening accidentally. It's not that he's afraid this is happening because, for example, he might believe that white women are more attracted to black men than they are to white men. On the spectrum of crazy conspiracy theories, that would be a lot less crazy than blaming the Jews, okay? Some white women prefer black men, and it's a well-documented fact. It's some. Let's not get into percentages here. It's not because he thinks that white men prefer Japanese women, which is documented to some, not all white men, not all, okay? I mean, it's not that he just thinks this is a result of the fact that people in their sexual predilections and preferences are naturally, once they have the option to travel around the world and date people of any given ethnicity, are going to intermarry with various exotic and foreign ethnicities. In terms of conspiracy theories, that would be a lot less crazy, even if you stated it in a racist and crazy way. No, he doesn't think this is happening accidentally. He doesn't think it's coming about due to economic circumstances in an unplanned and unforeseen way. He thinks this is a conspiracy. And for this conspiracy, he blames who? The same people who were blamed by the Magna Carta, the Jews. And it's not the topic of this video, but I would remind you, if you have actually read the New Testament, if you have just read the 4 Gospels of the New Testament, it's important to emphasize that anti-Semitic conspiracy theories begin right at the core of Christian doctrine, with the insane tendency to blame the Jews within a work of fiction that is supposedly, but not actually, the work of Jewish authors. So anti-Semitism is also baked into the Bible. Or I might say it's written into the Bible and baked into the whole history of the Christian church. And if you leap forward just a few centuries, did you ever hear of this guy, Martin Luther? Yeah, he had a hit book called The Jews and Their Lies. You don't have to Google it. You don't have to look it up on Goodreads to figure out that that's an anti-Semitic tract. So Christianity, from its inception, paradoxically, was an anti-Semitic religion. It's very comforting for Christians to think that their religion began as pro-Semitic and that the anti-Semitism crept in as a form of corruption later on. I do not think that theory endures even the slightest scrutiny that comes about from simply a critical reading of the Gospels as primary source text. I'm happy to have you join me tonight. This is a completely unannounced, spontaneous live stream, unscripted, no bullet point notes. I would just note there are 2 things you can help. Pardon me. There are 2 things you can do to help other people see this video. One is hitting the thumbs up button, however many or how few of you see this. But the other is, if you know someone interested in these subjects, copy and paste the link and actually send them the link in an email. I'm not telling you to spam people at random. It is only by you sending this video to someone in a Facebook message, in an email, that they will ever see it. I have now uploaded thousands of videos on controversial topics. I have uploaded videos that were censored for racism when they were completely clear that they were anti-racist. I have had videos that were censored for anti-Semitism, and then Google, the YouTube corporation, mysteriously changed its mind when I sent them evidence that I am myself a Jew. So there is a bizarre and unequal censorship process that goes on here. This video may disappear completely, but more likely it will go into a strange sort of gray area. It is neither blacklisted nor whitelisted, but gray. And those things change over time. I had one video that was really impossible to get by searching within YouTube about autism. And a couple years later, it looked like they changed their standards. That was no longer gray listed or hidden that way. On the other hand, I did some videos criticizing the culture of pornography, put it that way. I'm not, by the way, it's a nuanced critique. It's not that I'm completely against pornography or completely for it. I haven't got I don't know. Yeah, I have a moderate position, but there's a lot of critical thinking there and thinking about what the impacts of, for example, starting your own OnlyFans site and making your own pornography will be in your life. Several of those videos have now disappeared from YouTube entirely, whereas they got a huge number of views for several years. So the standards are always shifting. But I can tell you, I think I've challenged YouTube's decision to censor, demonetize, or delist over 100 of my videos for racism or anti-Semitism, I have had to write in again and again and again saying this video is anti-racist, not pro-racist. This is a critique of anti-Semitism. It's not pro-anti-Semitism. If you do not actually share the link with a friend so that they can see it, nobody is going to see it. That is the deal in the year 2022 here on YouTube. And guys, I think we should be positive motivated. We should say, hey, look, if we care about this content, I mean, in the old days, if you wanted a friend of yours to read a book, you had to buy a copy of the book and give it to him. No, it's not too much to ask. If you care about the content, copy and paste the link somewhere and let other people know what it meant to you. I have never heard anyone really critique multiculturalism as policy. Even reading in newspapers is a very insincere game being played by both the left and the right at the moment. And this is reflected in the mass shooters manifesto from Boston. So just to be clear, this fellow was 18 years old. Yeah, Melissa's off camera. She can correct me wrong. Yeah.
Is he from Buffalo? Or is he
Oh, right. I'm sorry, I misspoke. 18-year-old, and the shooting was carried out in Buffalo, New York, not Boston. I'm Canadian. I confuse Buffalo and Boston. I shouldn't. Yeah, sort of mistake I make. Two very different cities, very different history. Sorry. So this was a mass shooting carried out in Buffalo, New York by an 18-year-old. And he is not a particularly intelligent or well-read 18-year-old. However, what he is responding to is the most shallow and I think insincere critique of multiculturalism from the right wing, which goes as follows. The claim is that the left wing, and in the United States, the Democrat Party, they are only supporting multiculturalism. They're only bringing in all these different foreign ethnic groups, religions, so on and so forth, because they are confident that those foreigners, once they're in the United States, will vote for the Democrat Party, that they won't vote Republican, they won't vote right wing. In Canada or in the United States, what percentage of new immigrants are Hispanic? What percentage of new immigrants are Eastern European? Of the Hispanic and Eastern European immigrants, what percentage believe abortion should be legal? And what percentage believe it should be illegal? The reality is, look, I grew up surrounded by all these immigrant groups, right? It may be that there are people in the Democrat Party who are so delusional that they think immigrants from South America, Central America, even Spain, European Spain, like if you're Hispanic, that includes Spain, not just Latin America and South America. There may be some members of the Democrat Party who are delusional and thinking all those people will vote for the Democrat Party by default or because of the color of their skin. They won't. A lot of Hispanic people, a lot of Latino people are conservative in every sense of the word. On a specific issue like abortion, a lot of them would be associated with the Republican Party, not the Democrat Party. Now, those people, sorry, and I could repeat myself verbatim about Eastern European immigrants. Talking people from Russia, people from Ukraine. Got a lot of people coming from Ukraine this year, right? I think those are real liberal, free-thinking people who are, where you think they're not Christian at all. You think they're not anti-Semitic at all, for that matter. We can get into and again, I grew up surrounded by all these people. I grew up in a totally multicultural neighborhood in downtown Toronto. I saw all these new immigrants coming in and got to hear their political outlook on the world. So look, I mean, I don't need to go on and on about this, but tell me something. These new immigrants, do you think they're pro-war or anti-war? Like, one of the distinctive traits of the American left is being anti-military, anti-war, pro-peace, regardless of whether they're talking about Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan or, frankly, the current war in Ukraine. There is this anti-war agenda on the left. Have you met Nicaraguans? Have you met a lot of them? I mean, I don't know. What do we want to talk about? For the whole Hispanic part of the world, for the whole Eastern European part of the world. Now, I could go on in depth about what Chinese immigrants are like. So I speak Chinese. I speak, read, and write Chinese. I've lived in China for a couple of years. Wouldn't want to add it up exactly how much it is. I've lived in Cambodia, Laos, Thailand. I know a lot about East Asian culture. New immigrants from China. Have you ever talked to them about abortion? Have you talked to them? See, again, it's deceptive. New immigrants from China, regardless of their religious beliefs, you might be surprised at just how conservative they are. So there are several different ways in which this particular conspiracy theory is counterfactual, is fictional, can be challenged or exploded. And it may be that people both on the left and on the right believe it or participate in these assumptions. They work with these assumptions. But the theory is that multiculturalism is coming about as an intentional ploy supported by the left wing in order to replace conservative white voters with these other ethnic categories of voters. And then the next step into madness is to blame who? It's to blame the Jews. It's to blame that somehow, for some reason, this is in Israel's interest, or this is in the interest of Jewish people. You don't think there are a lot of conservatives or right-wingers in Israel? What percentage of people in Israel are pro-abortion? What percentage of people in Israel are anti? Jewish voters in America and Jewish political action committees in America, are they really left-wing? Are they? Have you looked at this? I mean, again, it's sort of fictional and incompatible with political reality in like 6 different ways simultaneously. But people really believe this stuff. And again, it's worthwhile to point out some of these things. The writer of that manifesto, and like the writer of the Christchurch manifesto before, the manifesto that was written in New Zealand, some things he feels he has to explain at some depth or length. But some things he feels he can just state as self-evident facts very quickly without demonstrating them. And I think it's really important to point out the extent to which deep-seated anti-Semitic assumptions are built into our current cultural discourse. They're built into our political discourse. They're built into what we think is a neutral appraisal of history. And then they shape the way we think about the future going forward. So I'm going to speak more about that in just a moment. If anyone has anything tremendously intelligent to say in the audience, I will read your comments and I will respond to them. If not, I'll carry on with what would otherwise be a monologue. I notice how hesitant you are to hit the thumbs up, guys. I notice. Maybe some of you don't know where this is heading. Maybe some of you think if you hit the thumbs up now, it's going to be on your record. It's going to be traced back to you. So Rasmus says about the censorship of my own channel, quote, I think it's fair to assume a lot of those bans were caused by automatic processes. So machine interpretation of the use of language based on keywords. So Rasmus, the particular instances I'm talking about, they've already gone through several stages of human review. So the reality is more pathetic, is that people who don't understand English very well have reviewed them. It has long been theorized that the bulk of YouTube's censorship employees are in India. Now, when they speak English as a second language, you can imagine how hard it is to distinguish. Like if all you see is a few keywords, like a video mentions Adolf Hitler, it's very easy for them to click through and ban something. They just know it says something about Adolf Hitler. What if you're actually making quite a nuanced statement? You're making a critique. What if you're quoting a text? You're quoting what someone else said, and then before and after you criticize it. So no, in the instances I'm talking about, it's not the work of machines. It is the work of remarkably incompetent people. And look, I sympathize to some extent. I've studied so many languages. I couldn't do that job in Cambodian. I couldn't do it in Laotian. I couldn't do it in Chinese. I said earlier, I speak, read, and write Chinese. Not remotely fluent in the Chinese language. Stay tuned, and you will see in the next few years how fluent I get in how many languages. Part of the action-packed plot twist coming up here, season 2 of à-bas-le-ciel. So Rasmus says, now I'm quoting, this is not my opinion, I'm quoting Rasmus, quote, I am against multiculturalism because I don't believe it's possible to mix all these conflicting values and cultures peacefully, close quote. I don't think peace is the meaning of life. I think conflict is an important part of life and society. I don't think that's a good enough reason to be opposed to multiculturalism. I don't. And I'll say this. We now live, if you live in any city anywhere in the world, we live in a world where we can take multiculturalism for granted to such an extent. Do you know what it's like living in a place where nobody has ever tried Chinese food, where there are no Chinese restaurants, where there are no Indian restaurants? Until recently, that was very common throughout Europe, throughout America. People would live and die their whole lives and never see a Chinese restaurant once, unless they went away to New York City or they went away to Paris or something. It used to be one of the marks of one of the great capitals of the world. And indeed, very often, the actual foreign cuisine you get there would not be authentic at all. It would be some white man trying to present you with his idea of what Chinese food was supposed to taste like, so on and so forth, because that kind of labor was so scarce, so hard to get a chef sent over from China. And indeed, whenever you're reading historical texts from the past, it'll mention, oh, we went to the Russian tea room, and for the first time in my life, I had borscht. How exciting! Oh, people used to live lives that were very narrowly monocultural. So I just caution you. Now, I don't think peace and conflict. I don't think this is sufficient to challenge or overturn the advantages of multiculturalism, which exist. So Oliver comments, and this is not ODS, it's someone else called Oliver. We have more than one person called Oliver in the audience. Oliver says, quote, there seems to be a way bigger anti-war in Ukraine sentiment coming from conservatives in the United States. Well, American politics is full of extremely entertaining contradictions. I would recommend taking a look at the absolutely horrible YouTube channel Democracy Now! I despise that channel. But if you look at Democracy Now!, you will see the stereotypical left-wing, the sky is falling, anti-war sentiment. Stereotypical blaming American corporations for whatever is wrong in Venezuela. Like that is really the loony left in America today. So yeah. Anyway, but look, I completely admit that the contradictions that exist today are very, very peculiar, including in the elections that just happened in France, the extent to which the right wing was pro Vladimir Putin. And the right wing was discredited by its positive connections to Vladimir Putin in the past. Okay. Brett Anderson says, quote, the left used to be anti-war, and they used to be in favor of free speech. But lately, many Democrats, many people on the left are going away from those values. This is what Brett Anderson says. I remember a quotation from a stand-up comedian. His name was Alexei Sales, or Alexei Sale, something like that. He was a famous comedian in England many decades ago. And he said that he was raised by communists. And these people, communists and far left-wing socialists and so on, he said they talked about peace. They said they were members of an anti-war movement. But what I learned with time was that they simply wanted Russia to win the war. They simply wanted to have wars that their side could win, not that the other side would win. And to be fair, is the right wing so much better? I mean, can we say anything good about conservatives to contrast to this? But yes, there is unspeakable hypocrisy on the left when it comes to matters of war and peace and foreign policy. And as unspeakable as it may be, I try to speak about it. I've grown up completely surrounded by left-wing people, so that's mostly what I criticize. But, now on the internet, you can look up lectures from the political science departments at the really weird Christian colleges in the States. I've seen a few of those, just a few. So there will be a YouTube channel for the College of Jesus Incarnate or whatever the hell it's called in the States. And they'll have lectures on politics and special guest speakers and so on put up there. If you think the left is bad, take a good long look at what's going on the right. You may have to recalibrate your assessment. But yeah, so these days both are bad. Another great question would be Cuba. What do the left and the right have to say about Cuba in 2022? just as a litmus test, as a sign of how much things have changed since the 1970s or even the 1980s or what have you. Fascinating comment from Wicked Energy. Quote, how come you don't join the cathedrals with other political commentators like yourself? I wonder if that was an autocorrect error, if there was some word other than cathedral was meant in that sentence. Yeah. So William McGeehan says he has said it himself. Most of the new people coming in from south of the border are anti-abortion. They are conservative in many ways. Not just that, but it's a telling example. Continue the quotation, quote, however, the Democrats will change what they say on abortion once they see which way the voters are. A suitably cynical member of my audience. Gee, do we have no idealists among us? Do we have no one to represent the raw optimism of youth in this? And we get a shout out for Noam Chomsky. Let me tell you something. Me and Noam Chomsky, we're the same age. You hold up a photograph of Noam Chomsky next to me. Who's better looking? Okay. Vegan diet, 0 alcohol, 200 push-ups a day. Do you want to look like me? Do you want to look like Noam Chomsky? That's how I win my political debates. When I get on stage with Noam Chomsky, he's at his podium of mine. I let him speak first, and I sit there and go, me and this guy, we're the same age. I'd also like to say that my writing about the political history of Cambodia is very much superior to Noam Chomsky's. I'd just like to take this moment to plug my own past work on the history and politics of Cambodia and contrast it to Noam Chomsky's and say that I'm the better master. I'd like to think my work on linguistics is better than Noam Chomsky's too, but it's a topic for another video. Yes. Okay. If you read primary source historical material from the Dark Ages in Europe, which is not my special area of expertise, but I've just read a lot of primary source historical and political sources generally. When you really read sources from the Dark Ages, one of the most remarkable, if subtle, features is the extent to which these people did not even perceive biological race. They did not see people that way. Now, some of you will say, oh, this is so left-wing, it's absurd. Do you think people were blind? Do you think they couldn't see the difference between a Turk and an Egyptian? Can you? This is 2022. Think about all the photographs you've been exposed to in your life, even if just passively. You read newspaper articles, you watch the news on TV. You're constantly being given contrasting images of different ethnic groups where the cues, the hints as to which ethnic group they belong to are quite subtle, but you're shown them again and again and again. And over decades, you develop an awareness, a subtle sense of perhaps what someone from Iran looks like and what, say, Jerry Seinfeld looks like. And many people, based on appearance, they might think I'm from Iran rather than being from Jerry Seinfeld. this kind of, you build it up over decades of exposure to photographs and contrasting examples, a type of exposure to ethnic differences that people in the Dark Ages did not have. And still, I ask you, how confident are you that you can distinguish a Turk from an Egyptian? How confident are you that you can distinguish a Greek from a Kazakh, a man from Kazakhstan? All right. Any of these groups we get into. All right. I grew up in downtown Toronto. I basically met every ethnic group of mankind. And we can say this is one of the advantages of multiculturalism. I really did grow up with contrasting the faces of people from all over the world. And sometimes they're really subtle differences. I met people from India and I met people from the Caribbean who really looked like they were from India. I have met Native Americans, people indigenous to North America. I have met people from Spain and Italy who very much look like North American Native people. All right, so let's just begin by recognizing the nature of the problem. And if you've had friends who were born and raised in China, you will have had them take you aside and say, look, I can't tell the difference between these different. How is it you Americans and you Europeans, you can see all these categories, and someone who grows up in China, they'll say, look, from my perspective, they can distinguish different types of Chinese people, but they don't have this refined sense of these ethnic categories. So the first point is, no, people in the Middle Ages, they were not blind, but they were hypersensitive to religious difference, and they were remarkably insensitive to ethnic difference. Now, the reasons for being sensitive to religious difference are to some extent obvious. People were being tortured to death because of their denominational affiliation. Which side you were on in a given war had everything to do with your denominational affiliation. The main and most fateful decision you made in life was of committing to a religion. And who it was you could marry, who was you worked with, everything about your social life was defined by your religion. However, for example, when Jewish people migrated into these places, right, the difference was religious, the difference was political, the difference was ethical. In a sense, they answered to a different code of ethics, different schedule of beliefs for who gets into heaven, who gets into hell, and precisely why. That was a challenge to ideas of ethno-nationalism here. But the difference in their actual appearance, the difference in the physiognomy or skin color or face, it would really not be something a medieval person could reliably discern. Now, I remember saying to a friend of mine who's Greek, we were talking about the possibility this time. Melissa and I were considering learning Greek and living in Greece permanently. And this friend of mine from Greece, everyone's going to think it's Kristen Leo. It's not Kristen Leo. Friend from Greece. And she insisted to me, she said, no. People there, they will assume you're born in Greece and will talk to you as a Greek. She said, just because the Greek people are ethnically so mixed, there is no recognizable set of facial features. They can't tell who is and who isn't Greek by looking at them. They're such mixed features, but they have no sense. The Greek people themselves can't identify who is and who isn't Greek. Remember we were saying this, is there one face that is what an Italian person looks like? And again, Italy's a long, thin country. Is there one face? Is there one set of ethnic characteristics? Through the Dark Ages, through that period, what was emphasized, what was fetishized was religious difference. Religious difference ran deep, and ethnic differences were relatively shallow and trivial. Have you heard of the Crusades? When Europeans went to fight the Crusades, so these are Christian armies representing Christendom fighting against armies representing Islam. The people in the Christian army were of every color and every shade and hue, right? Everyone they could gather together, including people from North Africa, right? Now, I'm not saying the composition was exactly the same, but both when they fought wars with the Ottoman Empire, with what do I want to call them, with the Saracens, with the enemies of the Crusades, right? And in negotiations with them, the Europeans were surprised to sometimes find themselves face to face with a white man who looked totally European. Still today with Turkey, you can still there are Turks who look like white Europeans, just ethnically their appearance, right? Sometimes they would sit down to negotiations and be face to face with someone who was a black African, a completely, it's the opposite extreme in terms of skin tone. And of course, a lot of the time, they'd be looking at someone who was a Mediterranean looking person where you really couldn't distinguish where from the Mediterranean. They looked like they could be from anywhere around the great circle of the Mediterranean coast. Person of they could be Spanish to look at them, but you really wouldn't be able. They could be Italian. They could be. Still today, if I used to have a friend from Syria. Can I tell you what Syrian people look like? Really? I mean, these are distinct. Okay, but in this context, the difference between Christian and Muslim, Christian and Jew was deadly, deadly serious, whereas those ethnic characteristics were not taken too terribly seriously. All right. Now, I'm just taking a moment to glance at your comments, you guys. Again, I see you're still afraid to hit the thumbs up. You don't know where this discussion is going. If you hit thumbs up now, you can change your mind later and you can undo the thumbs up. The origins of multiculturalism in the European tradition that were very directly transmitted to the United States of America, Australia, to European colonies of this kind around the world. The origins have everything to do with the unique historical experience of anti-Semitism and the arguments for tolerance that counteracted anti-Semitism. Now, this has its own history in England that's very easy to look up and read about, by the way, the passage of the laws for the tolerance of the Jews. It was much more dramatic and much more sudden in the context of the French Revolution in France. These were broadly similar. I'm going to choose not to narrate the British history for the purposes of brevity in this video. And I just mentioned, you can see this in the writing of Voltaire shortly before the French Revolution, in the time leading up to the French Revolution. One of the inspiring geniuses for the French Revolution was simply the awareness of France that they had to catch up with England, that England was more advanced in a variety of ways, including parliamentary democracy, right? And the early stages of the French Revolution, both the writing before the events themselves and the events leading up to the tennis court oath, those first relatively nonviolent stages of the revolution, they were very much framed in terms of catching up with England. The first law debated and passed by the revolutionaries in Versailles, right, was an edict on the tolerance of the Jews. It was an edict to end the legal bigotry, the officially sanctioned anti-Semitism that had carried on since the Dark Ages, and to normalize the political and economic status of Jewish people in France. And with this came the creation of the first modern form of anti-Semitism in the history of Europe. We had the first anti-Semitic conspiracy theories because there were royalists, there were traditionalists, many of them, of course, Catholic, right? What was their theory to explain who were the dark forces, who were the puppet masters pulling the strings behind this revolution? It became incredibly convenient to blame the Jews, to claim that the French Revolution itself was the result of a Jewish conspiracy theory. Now, the reality of what was going on there was simply that the Enlightenment intellectuals, again, partly just wanting to catch up with England, partly wanting to set aside and overcome the darkness of the Dark Ages. This was simply part of their agenda to have more of a religiously pluralist society, to end, I don't know, how am I going to put this? To end the era of witch hunting, to end the era of Spanish Inquisition style government enforced orthodoxy, and to enter into a more modern pluralistic era, such as England already enjoyed. Now, yes, in that period, am I claiming there was total freedom of conscience and freedom of religion in England? No, but they were several steps more advanced down that road than France was. And the type of French intellectual who went and took the tennis court oath and was involved in the early stages of the French Revolution, they were intensely aware of that. Now, French Revolution goes through a violent period. And then, long story short, who comes into power? Napoleon Bonaparte. It is very interesting to look at the unique anti-racism of Napoleon when it comes to Jews. He was anti-Semitic. He was a proponent of the Jews, of treating the Jews well and treating them equally, and so on and so forth. He was totally racist against Black people at the same time. Napoleon was a terrible person, but again, the positive connection between Napoleon and Judaism, this provided yet more fuel for the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory fire that in some ways went on unabated ever after, taking on new permutations and targets, what have you, right? Now, it's also interesting. I mean, I think in every instance you want to talk about anti-Semitism, one part of it is blaming the Jews, anti-Semitic conspiracy theory specifically. But then there's also a question of kind of who are you letting off the hook? Who are you not blaming, by redirecting interest towards, this anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. This type of theory allows the people of France to ignore the extent to which the people who were crying out for the destruction of the Catholic Church were themselves Catholics. That actually kind of 99% of the energy and intensity of the French Revolution came from Christian people who were pissed off with Christianity, were fed up with, who didn't like the status quo with Christianity. Now, for the members of my audience, all of you are willing to hear that. Say, oh, yeah, well, makes sense. The French Revolution, primarily fought by French people, yes. The people looting and pillaging Catholic churches at the time. It did happen. The people raping nuns, yes, pretty much all of them themselves Christian, if not Catholic, in this period of violent upheaval. Yeah. It seems to be much easier for people to live with this issue of blaming a foreign entity. And as I say, there can be no doubt that in the development of modern European national consciousness, the first paradigm for multiculturalism only involved two cultures, Christendom and Judaism. And the assumptions about how multiculturalism would work completely developed out of, frankly, the oppression of Jews by Christians. So a fascinating case study for this is the city of Prague. Prague is in the Czech Republic. Is it now called Czechia? You tell me. And would you even know where I'm talking about if I say Czechia instead of the Czech Republic? Formerly known as Czechoslovakia before. Anyway, Prague. In the Dark Ages, the city of Prague had a Jewish ghetto. The word ghetto today does not mean what it meant then. Okay? There was a law that every night all of the Jews would be placed behind bars. There was literally a gate with metal bars, there was a fence, and every night the mayor himself was supposed to put a chain with a big ornamental lock on the bars to lock away the Jews within this one neighborhood. Their ability to leave that neighborhood briefly. This was ghettoization. This was a ghetto in the true sense of the word. And periodically, there would be outbreaks of hysteria where people would blame this Jewish neighborhood, this ghetto, for all of the problems in their own society. So this is a real historical example. There was a theory, in every culture, every so often people go missing, whether they're murdered or they ran away or what have you. There was this theory that whenever a small Christian child would disappear, and I mean, some of these tragedies are the same as what we have today, but, it could be they ran away to join the circus. It could be their parents got divorced and they ran away to be with their father rather than their mother. You don't know what the story is, but and it could be some horrible, terrible thing happened to the child. Could just be they were killed or what have you. But when a child would disappear, there was this widespread theory. This is in Prague. In case you think, talk about the darkness of the Dark Ages, that this was because the Jews had a ceremonial need for human blood, preferably from young virgin children. And this makes it even more absurd, but they really believe this. Why? To produce matzah, to produce this special sacred kind of bread, the show bread used in Jewish rituals. If you have ever seen or eaten matzah, it's a white cracker. I mean, there's nowhere like how you could believe of all the food. Like if it was pudding or something, if it was a sausage or something, you could think there's human blood in there. But this was a type of flatbread, right? Ceremonial flatbread. I don't think it has any ingredients other than water, salt, and flour. I mean, maybe it's a very simple cracker-like flatbread. But anyway, even if they were making it more like a pita bread at that time, which is possible historically, this is really crazy. And there would be violence. They'd go and kill Jews in reprisal killings. They'd go and try to burn the ghetto down, kind of thing, to get revenge against them. All right. So you could say this is phase one of multiculturalism in the history of Europe. Now, again, Prague is a great example, and I am not saying Prague is unique. You will find throughout the whole of Western Europe and Central Europe, the same pattern plays out mutatis mutandis. Now, I do think when you get into the far east of Europe, further east than Prague, things are a little bit different. You can argue whether they're better or worse. I do think in the history of Greece also things would be different. When we talk about Western Europe, it's pretty much the same pattern that plays out here with Prague. The remarkable thing about Jews as immigrant communities in these cities is that they didn't really have a powerful connection to some kind of external home country, right? It's not as if they were still involved in the politics of Israel, a place that really only existed as an abstract idea, not as an actual, not as a place you were sending postcards to, right? Israel was something from the ancient past. The landmass was still there, but these were people living in Prague or wherever they were in Europe who really, in terms of language and politics, were quite committed to living in Europe, even if they were somewhat more cosmopolitan than other Europeans, even if they had connections between the different Jewish diaspora communities, this sort of thing. It wasn't the case that there was some other language, and the Hebrew language itself really was a dead language. Many people will say, oh, well, they continued reading and writing Hebrew for the sake of the Bible. When you look into it, the Jewish community in Greece would read the Bible in Greek. The Septuagint, have you heard of it? It's kind of historically significant. It's kind of the single most historically significant thing in the history of Europe, is that actually the Jewish people of Greece did not read their scriptures in Hebrew. They read it in Greek. In fact, not only did they read and write Greek, they did so to such an extent that there is a separate dialect of Greek that's called Jewish Greek. And it's not Hebrew. It's just the Jewish dialect of Greek. There were so many centuries with so many thousands of Jewish people living continuously from Greece. And Greece is geographically not that far removed from Egypt, Israel, however you want to put it, the Middle East. They're close enough to be in contact, right? Jews became part of the history of Greece. Right? And yeah, in case you haven't heard, the Jewish people and their religion had a transforming effect on Greece, on Rome, and on every other corner of Europe. So the influence was mutual, to say the least. Right? So what happens in a city like Prague is that you go through a series of stages where at the beginning, total isolation, quarantine, fear of contagion, hysterical conspiracy theories, right? Supernatural fear of Jewish people, of this other culture, of this other religion, which again is not based on ethnic characteristics, but it reflects a society where also different forms of Christianity are actively persecuting each other. Really, it's the death penalty for any kind of free thinking in Christianity. Very slight differences between, so look at the persecution of the Cathars. The Cathars are not Catholics. The Catholics killed the Cathars, on and on it goes. Very, very small differences in doctrine could justify you being massacred. Not even the Knights Templar were orthodox enough for the Catholic Church. Sooner or later, they had to go. This constant killing of people over minor doctrinal differences. But here in the midst of your city was a ghetto defined with gates and fences and chains, where there was a totally different ethical system, totally different religion. And it was tolerated, but just barely. Then you go through a series of steps. It's happened in Prague very discreetly. Okay, should we take down the chains? Should we take down the fences? Should we give these people the right to buy, rent, or own property or operate shops outside of the ghetto? Should we allow them to intermarry with the rest of the population? Should we allow them to attend the same schools? Should we allow them to train for the same professions, hold the same jobs? Step by step, this foreign culture is accepted and normalized. And very significantly, in Prague, I know this because I've seen the text myself, you actually get an intellectual countercurrent where there are Jews writing and saying, look, we're going to lose everything that's special about this community we've had if we go down this road of assimilating, if we embrace this, if we start intermarrying and going to the same schools as these people and eating their food and so on and so forth, right? And that there were Jews, and there were Jews who wrote and published pamphlets, and I think in some cases books, but normally a pamphlet for this kind of political statement is what survives history, who really felt something special had been created, frankly, by this kind of oppression, and that it was going to be lost. And it would be lost, and it is lost, and it's gone. Step by step, each of these ghettos cease to be ghettos, and the frankly insane fear of Jews as the definitive other, the definitive resident alien, right? Again, down to and including the British Magna Carta. It's the other nationality. It's the only other nationality or ethnicity mentioned in the Magna Carta. The Scots, the Cornwall, Welsh, none of that seems to matter. Is this monomania for this one other, no matter how tiny this ethnic minority, because it's such a challenge to orthodox notion of what society is supposed to be in the Dark Ages. And then out of this comes a fascinating form of optimism, because when the chains came down, when the gates of the ghetto opened up, what did the bumpkins of Christendom discover? They discovered that, in fact, the Jews were no different from you and I, that in fact we could live together, that in fact in so many ways we were all the same, which is hardly surprising because you already had centuries of assimilation that had taken place, right? But it's assimilation that was to some extent masked by this incredibly intense, racism that created a veil between the two communities. Okay, we jump forward to the aftermath of World War II and the creation of our modern multicultural doctrine. All right. There was this thing that happened in World War II, right? And at the end of it, there was a political consensus. If any of you know of any document where the leaders of the Western world actually debated this, I'd be interested to see it. To give an example, the peace treaty that was signed with Italy was debated for an unbelievable length of time after the end of World War II. There's this gap where World War II is over, but the political status of Italy remains unresolved. Another example I've just been reminded of, but I listened to the news from Japan, the political status of Okinawa. But actually for, I think, more than 10 years or so, sorry, it was 8 years, but for quite a few years, Okinawa was simply an American colony. It was no longer part of Japan. The Americans conquered it and ruled it directly as American territory. And then at a certain point, it was given back to the Japanese. So all kinds of weird gray area situations that didn't get resolved, that took a long time to negotiate in detail exactly what they wanted to do. But, the experience of World War II and the, unspeakable persecution of the Jews by the Nazis, and then the positive experience of the host countries receiving these people as refugees. The perception was that what refugees meant were people like Einstein coming to live among you, that there were these brilliant scientists, brilliant artists, brilliant intellectuals who were being persecuted in Germany, and this was more difficult to deal with. Also, there were a lot of Jews being persecuted in the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin. Now, that was inconvenient because the Western press, very much under the control of the U.S. government in America, it was really a government plot. They were saying all these positive things about Joseph Stalin because Stalin was supposedly your ally in fighting against Hitler, right? So it was a little bit difficult to admit this. Yeah, it's totally immoral, totally evil what Roosevelt did with Stalin that way. The plot to, have this alliance with Stalin. Okay, but this is a period of unbelievable optimism about refugee policy and multiculturalism, and unbelievable horror at the opposite. Nobody wants to be like the Nazis. Nobody wants to be like Joseph Stalin. And everyone recognizes that when you rescue these people, when you just let them move in, for one thing, during that period, a lot of the Jewish people who were fleeing for their lives, they brought with them a high level of education, some kind of profession, a fair bit of money. And here's the point again, no particular attachment to a home country like Israel. The Israel they were connected to was an abstract idea. It's like my connection to Athens. I have no connection to Athens as it exists today. There's an ancient idea of Athens. There's an idea of democracy, you know what I mean? That I have some kind of Athens as it actually exists today, I have no connection to, right? So they were connected by an idea of Israel. There's certain cultural ideas that come out of the Jewish tradition that still powerfully, united Jewish people, which I could wax philosophical about. right? But there was no comparison between the Jewish experience of being a refugee in the aftermath of the Holocaust and the experience of someone who now, in 2022, packs up their bags and moves to the United States of America from China as it exists today. Okay? The vast majority of people who move from China to America or who move from India to America today, I'm just going to use two examples, they will remain committed to politics in China, politics in India, politics in their home country. They will continue listening to the news about politics in India, politics in China, politics in their home country. They will remain passionate about the political questions that are determining the future of India, the future of China. Right now, the people who are escaping Ukraine due to the war, temporarily or permanently, let's say they immigrate to Canada. Do you think they're going to become fascinated by Canadian politics, by Canadian culture? No, it's completely understandable. They are going to remain deeply committed to and emotionally involved with the politics, the questions of their home country. Even if it is a home country they are fleeing. And I would point out, this is another community and language I've really studied and put years into. This is true even with Cambodia. Cambodia is one of the most extreme disasters in the history of the world. I mean, if we're going to make a top 10, it's somewhere in the top 10, guys. Even people who were fleeing starvation and persecution from communist Cambodia, some of them ran away to Paris, some of them ran away to Long Beach, California. They really powerfully remained connected to Cambodia, committed to Cambodia. And in some ways, it's a beautiful thing. I'm kind of a fan of Cambodian politics and Cambodian people. I've studied the Cambodian language. I've lived in Cambodia. I've lived and worked in Cambodia. There are ways in which I can appreciate this, right? But the political leaders who are part of this, I think, unexamined consensus about immigration and refugee policy at the end of World War II, after the Nazis had been defeated, on a very deep level, they assumed that we were taking the final step out of the dark ages, out of the attitudes of the ghetto and the chains around the Jewish neighborhood, into this modern era where we embrace all communities the same way that the people of Prague had eventually embraced the Jewish minority, right? There are a few bumps along the way there, right? Where we learned the lesson, it's really for the best. If you open up the gates, let everyone get married to each other, let everyone rent houses wherever they want to rent them, let's all just live together, and things work out splendidly, right? And there is this profound asymmetry between this asymmetrical relationship between oppressive Christendom, Judaism as a minority culture within it, right? And the current so-called Mosaic strategy of inviting in immigrants from China, from India, from Cambodia, all simultaneously. If you have relocated from Cambodia to Paris, the Cambodia you are connected to in your mind and your heart is not an abstract idea. It is not the ancient Israel of the Bible. It is not the ancient Athens that I in my heart am connected to, right? It is a real place. And you send emails back and forth every day, and you can watch their TV shows. God, I've known so many immigrants do that. I've known so many immigrants in Canada, and they never learn English because the minute they get home from school, they're watching TV in Korean. If they're a Korean family, the minute they get home from school, they're watching TV in their parents' native tongue. They're talking to their parents the tongue. That's what the TV they watch. I'll always remember being on this airplane with a woman who was coming back to Canada from Taiwan, and she had a stack of all of the gossip magazines. Now, these are the really crappy gossip magazines. It's just about the sex lives of the actors who are in soap operas in Taiwan. And she had it like seriously, she's sitting in the airplane seat. It's this huge stack of, I'm not kidding. She was a Taiwanese woman. She wasn't a huge woman. She had this huge stack of these gossip magazines. And I'm assuming she didn't want them to get messed up in her luggage. I'm like, I don't know. She wasn't going to read them all during the flight. And, I was saying to her, so you're reading for the next 5 years. Once you're back in Canada, you're going to watch all the soap operas. Once you get back to Canada, you're going to watch Taiwanese soap operas in Chinese. You're going to read these magazines, right? They remain utterly immersed in and committed to that language, that culture, that political reality. And now, there's more than one side of this. Where's our book on China, China within Canada? Maybe we can't find it. Do you remember I have that book about the panda has claws? I think it's something like that. We can't find it because we're reading it. All right. It's okay, babe. Don't worry about it. There have been several books written about the fear that immigrants from China remain loyal to China once they're in. Oh, there it is. Okay, sorry. It's underneath the camera, so I can't move it. Anyway, The Panda Has Claws is a better title. It's not the title of the book. The Panda Has Claws. Also a great name. Okay, I won't say. I used to get complaints saying that my laughter is fake. I was like, how could you possibly fake that? I may be laughing for reasons that are stupid, but it's not fake, okay? This is sincere stupidity on my part. All right, so you guys have probably heard, especially lately, I just shared a link on Patreon where there was actually a fear that the communists within the Black Lives Matter movement were connected to communists in communist China. And there's this fear that immigrants from China remain politically loyal to the Communist Party in China. There's this kind of thing, this kind of espionage. Yeah, well, my fear is actually much more simple, is that you grow up in a city like Toronto and you have an unequal, mutually unintelligible society where a very small percentage of the population is really committed to the political future of Toronto. Same for Vancouver, same for every other city. That you have a whole lot of people for whom Toronto is just a place they earn money, and their real life, their real emotional life, their real political life, everything they care about, right, is back in India, is back in China. That their influence, it's not really that I'm concerned that they're working as secret agents for China or secret agents for India or anything else. It's just that they are not really participating in the democracy and the debates and the contention for the future of Canada, which, by the way, may not even require assimilation. I don't think it does. I think it requires a type of commitment, right? And that commitment, I mean, it's not like the Jewish people of Europe. It's not like it was some kind of virtue. They had no choice. You're talking about Jewish communities that have been in Paris for 300 years, been in Athens for 1,000 years. You know what I mean? And their connection to Israel, as I say, is largely an abstract one. That's not what's happened with multiculturalism. So my concern is about the hollowing out of democracy, the lowering of intellectual standards in our society, which I'll explain in just one moment. It's not really any of the more conspiratorial theories about multiculturalism as such. And the great irony I want to draw your attention to in this video is that we live in a time when a series of mass murderers, including the Christchurch shooter in New Zealand, and the Buffalo, New York shooter just a few days ago, they both treat it as an unquestioned fact that the problem of multiculturalism is created by and for the Jews, for this Jewish conspiracy. A Jewish conspiracy we can already see brewing in the writing of the Magna Carta, in the choice to basically blame the development of modern banking on the Jewish minority and to refuse to see its real origins in Italy, specifically and especially in the city of Genoa. And I would point out, Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice is set in Venice. This is one of the most influential sources of anti-Semitism. I mean, it's an anti-Semitic manifesto, Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. And it doesn't occur to Shakespeare that there are bankers in Venice, and there are bankers in Genoa, and there are bankers in Florence. And in fact, the flourishing of the banking industry, eventually throughout all of Europe, but beginning in Italy, in the Mediterranean, that in fact, this is not a Jewish conspiracy. It's in fact the Genoese and the Florentines themselves, so on and so forth. And not too much later, just a few steps behind within those centuries, who was it that was developing banking in Holland and in the Netherlands and in Amsterdam, the great banks of. So again, the extent to which these things are, there's a monomania in this period for blaming the Jews. I've said several times to several different people recently that when I was a boy, it was rare and remarkable to have a taxi driver who was erudite and well-read. And I have several memories of this in England. When I was in England with my father, and my father would strike up conversation with the taxi driver, and the taxi driver would turn out to be a well-read, intelligent, opinionated person. They'd talk about politics, so they'd talk about whatever the subject was during the ride. And anyway, This often challenged my father's opinion of himself as a highly intelligent, well-read person. And you really felt the dynamism of British democracy. That's where does democracy exist? It exists in the pubs, it exists in the coffee shops, it exists in the taxi cabs, or else it doesn't exist at all. Democracy isn't something that only exists on a chalkboard in a university classroom, right? You have to have these kinds of people participating. You know, this is the harnessing of imagination and interest and energy from the population as a whole. Now, when I was in Toronto as a boy, or when you're in Toronto now, um, it's not remarkable to have a taxi driver who is well read and intelligent. It's remarkable to have a taxi driver who speaks English at all. What you struggle with is, and what you live with is the expectation, not just with your taxi driver. We went to a bank recently, not my regular bank. It was for different reasons. It was a bank other than the one I normally go to. And every single person we dealt with at the bank spoke English very poorly and was struggling with an accent. And each person's had a completely different accent. Whether it's at the bank, it's at the grocery store, it's with, you're taking a taxi, right? The expectation for the level of conversation, of discourse, right? It's lower and lower and lower. In the aftermath of World War II, when there was this tremendous enthusiasm, oh yeah, Jewish refugees, Jewish immigration, like Einstein and Mark Rothko, and it's kind of, oh yeah, there seem to be all these great luminaries, all these great intellectuals, all this potential, and all these entrepreneurs, all these wonderful people who are, again, some of them escaping Hitler, some of them escaping Joseph Stalin, some of them escaping other countries in Europe where they were just made to feel uncomfortable. Maybe they weren't quite as anti-Semitic as Germany, but nevertheless, people had reasons to get up and move to New York or Montreal or move somewhere they could move to. This great rescattering of the surviving Jewish population in the world after the Holocaust. If you had a Jewish taxi driver in New York in the 1930s, what are your expectations? And then again, what are your expectations for how society works as a whole? I don't think it's as simple as talking about assimilation. I don't. I really think it has to do with commitment to a place. By the way, let's be fair, Noam Chomsky, I've seen him describe growing up, I think in the 1930s. I'm off by a few, sorry, growing up many, many decades ago. He's very elderly. I don't know if he's that elderly. Sorry, maybe the 1950s. Let's change our estimate. But I remember him describing growing up in a Jewish neighborhood and the intensity of the debates about politics around what was then a newspaper stand. So there was a newspaper stand that had some cheap wooden chairs, and people would buy the newspaper and they might buy a magazine. I forget if they also bought cigarettes or this kind of thing. I forget, but predominantly newspapers and magazines. And old Jewish men would stand around and really seriously talk about politics. They'd really take time out of their day. There was no internet, right? And he credited this. He said, so he was a child looking at this. I think even if this was a few decades later, this was really the old culture of the 1930s. Okay, let me ask you, which country's politics were they talking about so passionately? They were talking about American politics. They were reading American newspapers. They were committed to and debating and concerned about the future of the United States of America. All right. Now, again, partly, so my own family contains Jewish immigrants. Partly they had no choice. So when my Jewish grandfather left Russia and came to Canada, he had no way he could continue participating in the politics of Russia. Russia was a communist dictatorship at that time, also intensely anti-Semitic. He's cut off from it. There was really no way he could participate in the politics of Israel. Israel ceased to be an abstract idea and became a very real political entity, but one he's totally cut off from. He didn't speak Hebrew. Probably nobody in his family had spoken Hebrew for 1,000 years or something. How far back would you have to go to find a Hebrew-speaking person in that lineage of my family? Other Jews in my family came from Poland. Once they arrived in Canada, do you think they gave a fuck? Do you think they could even name the prime minister of Poland? Could they tell you anything about, were they reading newspapers from? Were they go again? The internet didn't exist. They weren't reading magazines from Poland or watching movies from Poland. It's true. Some of the food continued. Some of them continued eating some Polish style food, but that's the last echo. Politically, the politics they cared about, the politics of Canada, the politics of the United States, they were really committed to the place. And that is indeed why you saw, for one thing, you saw, of course, the Jewish people joining the armies in all these conflicts. Jews, including my own ancestors, fought in the Canadian Army, fought in the American Army, right? But they were also involved in urban planning and getting elected at City Hall or lobbying City Hall and so on. The intense culture of concern. And by the way, if you don't know, Jewish people were massively overrepresented in terms of Black civil rights as a movement. It's not hard to figure out why. There were a lot of Jewish people who saw the injustice of how Blacks were treated, and they simply were not part of the culture of compromise that developed, for white Christians who've been in America for a few centuries longer. They were more uncomfortable with it, and more Jews were involved in that struggle. So, this kind of thing. The question is not politicized versus depoliticized. I've met Sri Lankan immigrants who are very politicized. The politics they care about are the politics of Sri Lanka. And they would go and talk to their member of parliament in Canada about Sri Lanka. Like when they go and talk to Canadian politicians, they're saying, hey, the Canadian government should do more to help Sri Lanka. And I'm sorry, every immigrant group today, the modern immigration phenomenon, the modern refugee phenomenon, this same pattern plays out. And I don't blame them. I don't vilify them for it, right? The problem I point to, it's not conspiratorial in nature. It doesn't have to do with espionage or undermining the politics of the status quo, right? What I'm really concerned about is the hollowing out of our already hollow democracy. I don't look back to some golden age of the past here, guys. I don't think democracy was better in the 1930s. I think it was terrible in the 1930s. And I think it's even worse now. It's like, okay, it was terrible then, and it's terrible now in different ways. What can I tell you? We barely had any claim to be a democracy in the past, and I see it further hollowing out and emptying. Okay. Now, look, I myself went to multicultural schools. Okay. Some of you have a sense of this. You have a poetry writing assignment. Okay. Did you go to a school where everyone spoke English as their first language fluently, and there was actually a competition for who could write the most brilliant poem, the most clever poem, where someone got patted on the head by the teacher and said, good, you did a good job? Okay. I went to school with a whole bunch of Chilean refugees. At that time, there were a lot of refugees from Chile. Okay. There were kids from Jamaica. I remember very vividly, one Korean guy who couldn't speak a single word of English when he joined our class. He could do the math, couldn't do any of the other lessons. And even, I remember a pretty Russian girl in my class, but still I saw her speaking Russian. She still spoke Russian as a first language. Her parents only spoke Russian, not English. And she was growing up trying to speak both languages. I remember that came up in class several times. Okay, I had all the advantages of a multicultural upbringing at a really intensely multicultural school in a multicultural part of town. And by the way, most of the cultures were white. Greek people count as white, okay? But let me tell you something. The Greeks, they're from another culture. They speak a different language. I knew Greek people. Their parents spoke Greek. Like that was the reality. Oh, yeah, and I remember that. I remember a friend of mine telling me, so this is maybe an interesting contrast to Noam Chomsky's experience. I remember where the shop is, too. I forget if I showed it to you, Melissa. So there's a particular shop around the corner from my school, very much in the neighborhood I grew up in. And this friend of mine told me, I didn't witness it myself. He said, a couple weeks ago, he told me, he was walking past here, there was this group of old Greek men standing here. And there was still, it wasn't a newspaper stand, but it was a convenience store that sold newspapers, among other things. And there were these old Greek men, and they were angrily shouting at each other and cussing each other out. And he said, I wanted to know what the political debate was about, what it was that we're discussing. So he asked his dad, and I remember this guy's dad was an interesting character. His dad went over and stuck his nose in, like, what are you guys debating? And what the Greeks were debating so angrily was whether Alexander the Great was a Macedonian or a Greek. That's what my point being, they're Greek, they're white, but they speak another language, they're from another culture, and they are still committed to the politics of Greece. The Russians were still committed to the politics of Russia. The pattern we have today, these people, they're not committed to the politics of the place. And in the classroom, when I'm sitting there, okay, I cannot have a poetry writing competition with the new immigrant from Korea, with the new immigrant from Russia, with the new immigrants from Chile. We can't, all right? Instead of developing really sophisticated discourse, you have a situation where the people who speak English as their first language are in a situation of perpetual privilege. Like, it's really easy for me to get an A+ on this book report, right? And where it's an enormous struggle for the children of the new immigrants. And when you're in a situation where they're the majority or even just a plurality, they're a significant percentage of the kids in the classroom, right? All of the education has to come down to their level, right? The same way when you take a taxi ride with a driver who can just barely speak your language, you can just communicate where you're going on the map and go this way, not that way, then that's it, right? The quality and caliber of your conversation, right? It's going to have to come down to that minimum level. Teachers, and teacher may have 40 students. Now they've got to struggle, not with teaching you more sophisticated and erudite concepts, but the simplest level of concepts that those kids can handle. And then if you do anything more advanced, still so much of the teacher's time and energy is going to have to go to helping those weakest students. And what happens if you don't? What happens if you have an education system that's pitched to the most talented 10%? The main talent we're talking about here is fluency in the English language. That's what's really differentiating these people. So then you'd have lessons that are more sophisticated and erudite, and that only the kids who speak English as a first language can really understand, and the others are left behind. It doesn't end in primary school. It doesn't end in high school. This is a massive problem at the university level. And for many of us, because the universities want to make money inviting in foreign transfer students, the universities are more multicultural. The level of English being spoken is lower. The percentage of students who speak English as a second language or who barely speak English at all is tremendous. And I have been in those situations again and again. I mean, my whole life, I've been in university, in and out of university for so many years. I want to say between 1997 and 2021 or something, right? I've been in university classrooms all the time where, it's meaningless for me to be brilliant. It's meaningless for me to be erudite or well-read. I'm competing with people who are just struggling to read the book at all. I'm competing with people who put up their hands and are asking in broken English, "Sir, I don't understand why I got this wrong on the test." All right. And we don't have philosophical debates. We don't have political discussions. We have plodding, low-level discussions with students who can barely write an essay in English. That's the real test, is can you write essays in English? Where they're trying to scrape out a few extra percentage points because they don't really have the minimum requirements to attend high school in English, but here they are now in university. Okay, it doesn't stop in primary school, it doesn't stop in high school, it doesn't stop in university. It continues in Parliament, and it continues at the police station. I've been interrogated by cops who can't speak English. I've been interrogated by cops who can't speak English in foreign countries where I'm making the effort to speak their language. You know what's scarier? Being interrogated by a cop who can barely speak English, who is right here in Canada. In this way, multiculturalism has undermined the assumptions that made our barely functional society barely function. I don't have any of the delusions that go into the Make America Great Again anti-immigrant movement. I don't think America was great in the past. I don't think Canada has some golden age that we can return to. I think the golden age is in the future. I think America really can be something great. I think America doesn't have democracy yet, but I think that it is uniquely well positioned now to achieve it.